The one you waited for, Liz Goodwin. Here she is.
Hi there. Well, today we're going to talk about this amazing subject of clean and unclean. And I've got a spoiler for our audience, Jackson. I don't think I actually have any answers. I think I'm going to pose some interesting questions tonight because it is a fascinating subject, the subject of clean and unclean. So let me just begin by, as it were, painting a picture. We've got two homesteads. They only have clean animals, right? We've got husband, wife, two kids.
Okay.
This one on this side, he decides to butcher a cow. The blood goes in the ground. He uses the fat from the animal to make soap. Okay, all good. The guy on this side, he decides to do the same thing. He's going to slaughter his cow, but he decides to make blood sausage with the blood. And he decides that he's going to render down the fat and use it for cooking. Now we've got two homesteads. They only have nominally clean animals. There's no swine there. So we've got the same ingredients. It's just that this guy has done what the Lord tells him to do, and this guy has defiled himself and his family. He's defiled the land. Now, that's really fascinating, isn't it? Because we could understand that these horrible things that we're not supposed to eat could defile us. But it seems as well that the Lord says it's going to defile the land.
Blood and fat will defile the family and defile the land.
Yeah. And that is so fascinating because, again, we see that it is only uncleanness that spreads, isn't it? We see this throughout the Old Testament. Why is that? What is what is the thing that is actually passing from an unclean object to a clean object that makes the clean object unclean? What are your thoughts on that, Jackson?
I know that the ancient Pharisees would say that if you mingle the unclean with the unclean does not come clean, just the opposite. The clean becomes polluted.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That's my understanding. And I think what is so fascinating to consider is, well, okay, why is that? What is the thing that passes from the unclean object to the clean object?
You think there's something actually evil, or I guess I'll have to say unclean, that goes into the clean to make it unclean?
I think this is just a question that we're going to ponder this tonight in various different ways. So let's think again, like the next thing that is on, as it were, on my list that goes down this particular fascinating road is, okay, so why is a woman unclean when she's menstruating? I actually heard a preacher who I have great respect for say some years ago that, of course, we didn't have hot and cold running water in those days, but God didn't say until. A woman is not unclean until we figure out some way. It doesn't seem to be about bacteria or viruses or the blood itself. It doesn't seem to be about that.
No.
When we consider the slaughter of an animal, the type of blood that comes out of an animal is its lifeblood. And what is interesting is, this was Zach Bauer a few years ago, who was talking about being a homesteader and how you learn about the law when you have animals, and it's really fascinating. And he said there are two types of blood. There is the hemoglobin in your veins, your arteries, your capillaries, and then there's this myoglobin, which is in the muscles. And he said, if, for example, you were in an accident and you got really badly beaten up, all your muscles got really badly beaten up, if that myoglobin comes out of your muscles into the bloodstream, it'll kill you. They're not meant to mix together. So we have sort of two separate systems. They obviously, they're in some way connected. The whole, everything in the human body is sort of seems to be connected, but there are these special barriers, as it were, that these things are not supposed to cross.
There's something scary about blood, especially if you look into the Leviticus 17, saying the life is in the
Yeah.
blood. That's another big question. What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, this is exactly, it's just, yeah, it's a really huge thing, because when a woman is menstruating, the blood that comes out is actually from the veins and arteries. It's lifeblood that comes out when a woman menstruates. Is that why a woman is unclean? Is it because it's ultimately the same, it comes from the same source, the same system as the animal's lifeblood that
Well,
is supposed to go on the ground?
it's called ritual uncleanness today among scholars.
Mm.
And they seem to want to diversify what's ritually unclean from anything else. You kind of think of ritually, that just means having to do with being in the temple or in the middle of religious services or something like that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, not. But
No.
who's clear on that?
Well, the Karaite Jews, who they apparently only keep the Mosaic law, they don't have any of the Talmudic additions. Karaite women don't go to the synagogue when they're menstruating, which would make sense to me. But again, it's like, well, I have more questions than answers, really.
I wish you had some answers here.
Well, I think it's such an amazing subject. And if anything, what I'm going to talk about tonight is really, I hope, going to help the audience to feel more of a sense of awe in our Creator. Because at the end of the day, our understanding is not the important bit. Our obedience is the important bit.
That's true.
And very often we seek to understand and we miss that mark because there may be some other thing going on, perhaps even an ulterior motive as to why we might want to make something mean something that was not the original intention. There are people out there now who are raising pigs on grass and saying that somehow this is okay. No, it's not. And when we look at unclean animals, when we think about pork and shellfish and those kind of things, shellfish, as I understand it, they really are the filters of the ocean. That makes sense to me, that they are really, really, really toxic.
Well, if you check, I think if you check the difference between the land crustaceans and the sea crustaceans, you're really not going to find much difference.
Yeah, yeah. And it's one of those things. I haven't eaten those things for a long time. It's just no. I never liked them, even when I didn't exclude them from my diet. But I've, those and pork, obviously, I haven't eaten those things for many, many years.
All I know is I don't know what it is that makes them unclean. However, the scripture says that you will abominate yourself. That's enough for me.
Yeah. And I was looking that up today.
I have to speculate.
Yeah, this idea of making yourself detestable, to be abominable before God. No, I don't want that. No, that's, I love God. I just want to be pleasing to him. So, but we have this idea with unclean animals that it is about toxins. And that makes some sense to me when I think about shellfish particularly. I know that they are filters and that there may be all kinds of accumulations of toxins in them. And yet with animals, there is perhaps a tendency then to say, well, okay, if we raise the pig on grass, then surely, some people start to think that this might be okay. Well, this is where it gets interesting for me, because I don't think this is anything to do with toxins. When we consider some of the plant foods that humans eat that have to be prepared in very specific and careful ways to reduce toxins. No. Many native peoples, I believe it was Aborigines in Australia, they have a particular plant which is an important food source. But if it isn't prepared right, it's harmful. There's lots of those. When we think about potatoes, potatoes are good, green potatoes are bad, the berries are bad. We don't want to eat those. Those are actually poisonous. Like asparagus, I found out today that the little berries on asparagus, so we can eat the spears but not eat the berries. The berries will make you sick. So it's not about toxins. There's no list of poisonous plants in the Bible. God has not warned us about these things. So I don't think it's to do with that. My feeling is that this is in some way a spiritual thing, something that's beyond our perception. And it's just something that, as I say, I think that the, the main thing is our obedience, because I don't think we can understand this. So when we think about what might pass from an unclean object to a clean object, we're told in Leviticus that, for example, mice and moles and lizards are unclean to us, and that if we touch them when they're dead, we will be unclean for a short period of time. We'll be unclean until evening. But then we have this really interesting passage where it says that any earthen vessel into which any of them falls, you shall break. And whatever is in it shall be unclean. In such a vessel, any edible food upon which water falls becomes unclean, and any drink that may be drunk from it becomes unclean. Now, Jackson, I don't know if you know the history of pottery and earthenware and glazing, but as I understand it, there was glazed pottery like we have today, similar to that, in 9000 BC. So what's your understanding of that? If you came down in the morning to find that your coffee cup, your lovely China coffee cup, had a dead mouse in it.
Oh, I think it has to do with being porous. If it's not
that
fired,
was my thought too.
It's going to be porous, and it's going to suck in anything that happens to contain.
Yeah, and they certainly would have had porous vessels. They would have had earthenware vessels, which apparently moisture moves very slowly through them, and it was also helpful for cooling the contents. So they would have used those things, but they would also have wanted to use some kind of glaze or varnish to stop moisture from simply leaking through. So that was my understanding too. And so I really don't know. I think I'll just share with you that because I've had a very hectic couple of weeks. And at one point I was helping out a local charity. They had a dog who'd been hit by a car, and she'd just come out of the veterinary clinic. And a friend of mine had sort of shown me these pictures of this poor dog. And I said, well, I can help out, but I can only take it temporarily. So they brought this lovely dog to me who was in a lot of pain, and they left me with a load of stuff for her, you know, food and stuff like that. And when it came to feeding time, I opened the bag of food, and I suddenly realized, like, I've got this thing in my hand, and I'm like, this is unclean. It's like, and I looked at the packet, looked at the ingredients: meat and animal derivatives. Ooh, that doesn't sound nice to me. So I got a plastic food box. It's all I had, a plastic food box to feed her from. And I put some of this food in there and broke it up for her and gave it to her. And then, because she was in a lot of pain, thankfully we found her forever home on the same day, and we think that that was a miracle, because I don't know how I would have coped with her. She needed an injection, and I wasn't able to do it single-handedly.
Lucky dog.
One person. Yeah, absolutely. So when the new lady and her husband came and they gathered this lovely dog up and took her out, I put the rest of the food in that box and gave her the box as well, because I felt as though I'm never going to use that plastic box again, because it's like, no. That's whatever's been in that. No, unclean. It's unclean. Am I right about that? This I don't know. Plastic is not something that we have any rules about, and plastic doesn't absorb. So in theory, you could say, well, you could clean it, but I don't know that. And my feeling was
particles will stick to it.
Yes.
No matter how hard you scrub it, sometimes particles will stick into places that are cut or scratched.
Yes. Yes, I was quite happy to just let the whole thing go. That's it. Take the unclean food and the dog. But yes, just very, very interesting, this idea that we don't know if their pottery was glazed or not during that time, whether this is specific to unglazed pottery or not. But then we move on to this other area of, well, discharges. Not a pleasant subject, but in Leviticus 15, we have the law concerning bodily discharges. Now, here we're told about a man. If a man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean and he's unclean. Now, here we have a longer period of uncleanness, just like we do when a woman has a discharge, whether it is the customary expected 7 days or longer than that. It's as long as this is happening, you're unclean. And if for a woman it goes beyond her 7 days, then she has an additional 7 days beyond the point where her discharge ends. This is a longer period of uncleanness. And again, that's really interesting, isn't it? Why is that? Why are some things we can cleanse them? For example, here we have the vessel of earth that he who has the discharge touches shall be broken, and every vessel of wood shall be rinsed in water.
Well, you would think that some of these discharges would be indicative of disease.
Yes.
I suspect.
And if, for example, if for example, you had an abscess, now it actually says here, whether his body runs with his discharge or his body is stopped up by his discharge. Sounds painful either way. If perhaps you have an abscess, what's going on in there? You've got pus.
Infection. Yeah, infection.
Yeah.
Pus.
Yeah. And pus is dead white blood cells. That's what that is. So this idea again of, for the man with the discharge, we have to break every vessel of earth, but every vessel of wood shall be rinsed with water. Now, interestingly, this is not repeated when a woman has a discharge of blood. It's not repeated in that passage. And I thought it would be. In fact, in my mind, I had actually sort of superimposed that. And when I read it through again, I thought, well, actually, that does not say that, which is interesting in itself. I don't know why that would be. But do you know why the wood shall be rinsed in water rather than being broken or burnt?
Gets me. All I know is that's what we are told, and it's something that we dare not be disobedient to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unless of course, the Torah has passed away.
No,
as so many
not.
say. Okay.
Yeah, definitely not. Now, there is perhaps a little bit of understanding that we have on this particular subject, and I'm not sure what the relevance is. Many years ago, in England, it was very popular to tell people that wooden cutting boards, oh, they're very dirty. You want to get rid of those. You want these nice plastic ones. And plastic cutting boards became the new thing. In fact, they didn't just have plastic, but they would sort of try to embed this substance called triclosan into the plastic, which is a type of antibiotic. And it actually turned out after some years that science caught up with the fact that wooden cutting boards don't actually breed bacteria. And so a lot of us got rid of our plastic cutting boards because...
Well, I know I've got a plastic cutting board and it scratches just as much as the wood does, actually. Yeah. The thing is with the plastic, you can really see in the little cracks and crevices something in there, and you can scrub till you're blue in the face and it won't come out.
No, I had some really horrible ones, and they would get mold on them and things like that, even more than the wooden ones, which I don't know why that was. Very, very strange. So every vessel of wood shall be rinsed in water, but the vessel of earth shall be broken. Very interesting that we have this difference. And And at the end here that I underlined some years ago, thus you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. Yeah, very, very interesting. Very, very fascinating.
Where is that tabernacle today? My understanding that it's the human body to some extent.
Yes.
That when it talks about defiling the tabernacle nor the temple are still here. The prophet said that that will at one time be the human body. So you're defiling yourself.
Yeah, yeah, and it's something. It's been one of my challenges here in Ukraine is to you know, I've always got like the smartphone, and I can take a photograph of the ingredients. And then I can put it through the classic, you know, the Google Translate. Okay, Google Translate, I can import the image, I can select the text, and I can find out what's in things, because that is a challenge here, knowing exactly what's in things. And it's very important to me to make sure that I don't just sort of accept something without question, because, you know, pork is popular here.
You don't even have a Latin alphabet there. You're using something like a Cyrillic alphabet.
Yes, and there's Cyrillic Ukrainian, and then there's Cyrillic Russian, and they're both in this part of Ukraine. So it's yeah, it's a big challenge. So another question: why does contact with a grave make someone unclean for 7 days? Why is that? What do you think about that, Jackson?
Because
just walking over a grave.
Ghosts come up and down out of graves.
What's your view on that? Do you think that there is such a thing?
As a ghost?
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I believe it's an evil or unclean entity that is disguising itself usually as a person that you might have known sometime in their life. I don't think that it's like the person comes up out of the grave. I think it's the spirit that they took down with them, or the spirit that they left behind on the earth in their demise.
Yeah, I really don't know. Having read 2nd Esdras chapter 7, that really made me kind of question a lot around this subject, because having lived in old houses, and yeah, that's just a fascinating area.
Well, in my earlier days, there were many times when me and some of my companions were called down into a house or an apartment where somebody had moved in, and there were all kinds of strange manifestations there that you had to drive out of the house, and most of the time they didn't come back. So something actually happened in that exorcism act. So we can't see them, but even Carl Sagan said that if a fourth dimensional creature existed, it could do these kind of things, walk through walls, even tear you from inside out if it wanted to, if it was permitted to.
Yes, that's very, very true.
Yes.
I lived in England opposite a house which I knew the lady who lived there for many years. I knew her very, very well. And she told me that she had seen furniture move in her house. And I've never forgotten her lodger ending up on my doorstep one night asking me when this woman's husband was going to be back, because she was due to be out for the night and the husband was due to be back late. And when I asked and found out for him, it's like, oh, he's going to be out tonight. This guy was like, can I stay on your bed settee? Because I'm like, don't want to go back in there. He had gone into the house. He'd switched the hall light on. The light had gone off. He thought, oh, he didn't think anything of it, you know? He walked up the stairs, put the light on, and then it was as if a fridge or a freezer had opened in front of his face. There was this cold blast, and he left the house just like that. 6 foot tall, rugby player, big guy. No, he wasn't going to spend the night in that house. And when you think about this phrase, the land will vomit you out. doesn't that, I mean, I when I think about that, I think about that poor guy leaving that house in absolute like,
Oh, I see. Yes, I
yeah,
never thought of that in that respect before.
yeah, to
But
be
even the
driven out.
property will kick you out of it if
Yeah,
it's inhabited by something that doesn't like you.
yeah, yeah. So we never really got to the bottom of that. When she moved out and new neighbors moved in, I had a couple of conversations with them about it, and they were sort of like, "Oh, well, yeah, no, I don't think there's anything," and I'm like, "Yeah,
Mhm.
actually." But yeah, it's one of those things that
Oh, I don't doubt it.
again, we don't
I've
understand.
I've seen and heard those manifestations time,
Yeah,
really time after time. In one
yeah,
particular situation, my friend, his house was absolutely haunted with something horrible. And it
yeah.
took us 4 years to get that thing out, but we finally did.
Oh,
And it
wow.
wasn't just a thing, it was
Yeah,
a collection of things. And that had been a new house to him. So
yeah,
who can explain it? All we know is that we can have power over it if we choose to take that power.
yeah, yeah. It's very, very important that we do absolutely rely on the authority that we're given in Messiah. But again, if we are engaging in unclean activities and we are defiling ourselves, defiling our homes, defiling the land, then we're creating legal grounds and legal rights for these
Yeah.
things to come in and cause problems for us. And when we think about the walking over a grave, now, when I was a child, it was absolutely natural that you told children not to walk on the graves in a
Yeah.
graveyard. I don't know whether they had some understanding of the actual biblical significance of that or not. I really don't
Whether,
know.
yeah, whether it was just their custom not to. I remember being
Yeah,
told that many times,
yeah,
visiting on Memorial Day. Didn't really want to go, but
yeah.
it didn't really match up the idea that there was some kind of dead spirit or some entity down there in that grave that was going to come up. But surely
Mm,
that rose from some
mm.
superstition at one time or the other.
Yeah, but
That's
it has
scary.
that biblical basis, doesn't it? So the idea that we should not walk over a grave. And what is so fascinating with the English church system was that the majority of parish churches, of course, were originally Catholic. And so they all had a crypt underneath the altar with a relic or a skeleton of someone. Someone who I think the idea was that this was supposed to be someone who was a saint. I'm not quite sure. But then it became very popular for people who were, shall we say, well-to-do. It became popular to for those people to choose to be buried actually inside the church under the floor.
Look at Westminster
So you
Abbey.
just
I mean,
imagine,
there's more people
yes,
buried down there in that church than there are that come to the church.
yeah, yeah. And so you imagine your C of E, you go to church on Sunday in your parish church, you walk in, you walk down the aisle with the gravestones, you
Mhm.
walk over a grave, you sit down, you listen to the lovely sermon from your local vicar. You have been made unclean. You go out, you spend all week with your family, you come back the next week and you're made unclean again.
Isn't this just
How is this?
superstition, Les? Or is there really something to this? Or is it
It's
superstition?
no, it's definitely yes, because when we think of the words of our Messiah, one of the things that he said was he described, I think it was the Pharisees he was talking about, being like unmarked graves that people walk on and they don't realize that it's
Mhm.
happened. And it's actually, let me just see, I'm going to go do a quick search and find it because it's actually, I think it's in the book of Numbers. Contact with a grave or with a bone will make you unclean. Let me just see if I can find it. I think it's this one. Let's see if I can. And whosoever toucheth one that is slain with a sword in the open field, or a dead body, or a bone of a man, or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. Numbers 19:16. So this is something, again, this idea of the uncleanness of the dead. And when we think about the duration of uncleanness, so we have some things that make you unclean until evening, some things that make you unclean for 7 days, or for 7 days beyond the time which this thing stops. And then we have, for example, contact with a dead body. So actually, touching a dead body, as I understand it, you need the water of purification to be cleansed properly from that. But in this case, we're looking at being unclean for 7 days through being in contact with a grave. Why is that? What is that about? It's such a fascinating subject.
I guess
because
part of this has to do with water. Getting into water,
yes,
washing oneself.
yes,
In this,
Yep.
is it a symbolic fashion, or is this an actual washing away of something that's foul, evil, or unclean?
Yeah,
I don't know.
very interesting. It's very interesting. Again, I think it was a comment by Zach Bauer, again, talking about the fact that most people at the time actually didn't wash. It was not a common thing for people to wash. And so you would be very different as a people if you regularly washed. And clearly regular washing was very much a part of this, of being clean. And therefore, in some way, there's something that you're washing off, which is more than simply perhaps dirt or toxins. It's not so clear. And as I said, I don't really have any answers, but I can, I can pose some interesting questions.
We want some answers.
Such a fascinating thing. Well, I think that we have to seek to walk in obedience. Those questions, particularly around going back to the mouse being unclean. So you go to your grain. You're going to sow your grain. All right. You find a dead mouse in the grain, and you mentioned water. If the grain is dry, it's fine. You can go and sow it. But if the grain is wet and there's a dead mouse on it, you can't. Now that would sort of, we would perhaps have a human understanding of that, just from a kind of an ew perspective. That's just gross. The thought of a dead mouse in water, not nice. And rodents of any kind, they have all sorts of horrible diseases, leptospirosis in rats and all sorts of horrible things. There's a reason why we don't want them near our properties, and why we would very easily understand that they're unclean. But you can sow the grain if it's dry. And if there's a vessel, an earthen vessel that's had a dead rodent in it, for example, or a dead lizard or whatever it might be, it is putting water in it that brings out that uncleanness. So it may be to do with porosity. I don't know. It's just an absolutely fascinating subject. And when we think about the defilement that comes from disobeying these laws, going back to that original example, so you've got on this side, you've got the family where the cow has been slaughtered and the blood has not gone on the ground, but actually gone into the people. Like I say, we've got the same ingredients in both scenarios, but in this one, it's defiled. The people are defiled. The land is defiled. Where does that end? It seems that defilement is the thing that grows. And then, of course, ultimately leads to people being vomited out of the land. And that is just,
Particularly disgusting to me is eating the blood in puddings, in soups. I know in a number of countries, they actually use that blood there to make soup, and people fall on it. They just love it. I couldn't imagine touching that.
No. No. In England, we have something called black pudding. That's exactly what that is. And not only is that a blood sausage, but it's made from pork.
Mhm.
So it's pig's blood. I mean, it's just
Well, I
absolutely
imagine
gross.
some people listening to this is going to laugh about this, saying, "Oh, we've been eating that since I was a child. Nothing wrong with me. I mean, it's good, and we've enjoyed it. We've never seen any kind of detriment from it."
Yeah, they haven't tried going without, because that was my experience when I was looking at Torah, and was sort of, I was very curious about this law. What's this all about? And so I decided one of the first things I did was I'll give up pork and shellfish. I'll just see what happens. I'll do it as an experiment. But the conviction was so strong
Oh,
that I knew I couldn't go back. I felt it. It's like, I can never go back. I can never eat it again. That
I
to
fought
me
it and fought
was,
it. Hmm. But when I made up my mind, I just had never did it again, and I don't
yeah,
feel any loss. That's for sure.
no, no, no. But what age were you when you came to
Oh,
that
I'm going to say
viewpoint?
about 25, 26.
Oh, so yeah, yeah, a lot younger than me when I came to that point. So yeah,
Did you
I
actually
mean,
eat blood
in
pudding?
England,
Did you eat blood pudding
no,
in
I
England?
never ate that. Oh, no,
Okay.
it's very pop. It's fairly, I say, fairly popular. It's one of the traditional foods that sort of goes with particular geographic areas, particularly common, I think, more in the north of England. It's really, really popular. But it's one of those foods that's sort of dying out over time. It's less and
Good.
less popular. Another one, of course, is jellied eels, and they're not clean either. In Essex, that's a common thing, is jellied eels. And in fact, where I used to live, I was near the cathedral city of Ely, and it's why it was named Ely, because they used to catch eels in the
A lot
river.
of gills there.
So it's one of those things that we have. Yeah. Here in Ukraine, I've been looking and trying to work out which fish are kosher and which are not,
Mhm.
because they're very different fish here.
Yeah.
And that's quite a challenge, because they have this beautiful white fish called wolffish, and I've seen it in the freezer, and I'm like, I had to go and look it up. Not kosher. Okay, won't be having
Mhm.
that one then. So it's actually a type, I think it's a type of catfish. No, definitely not kosher. So we try to walk in obedience. We try to walk in love with our God, and to walk in obedience to Him, because we know that this law is for our benefit. It's not there. These laws are not arbitrary. That's something I would very firmly say to people. God absolutely knows. He knows exactly what it is that passes from an unclean object to a clean object, to make the clean object unclean. He understands that fully. We don't. But it seems that uncleanness is the thing that spreads, and that cleanness is a very, perhaps we might say, it's a more rare commodity.
Mhm.
Clean things, much more rare.
Mhm.
Um, so, what are your thoughts on that subject, Jackson? What do you think on this subject of clean and unclean?
I have a lot of thoughts on that subject because, well, let me give you an example of something that I
Mhm.
experienced in a church. I guess this has probably been about 15 years ago or so, talking to a church pastor about this, knowing that I was into Hebrew roots. The pastor was a pastor for my parents. And I went to the church there when I was visiting once. And when we went out to eat afterwards to a Chinese restaurant, and I went with them, and the pastor, after talking extensively about clean and unclean, he came back from his buffet with his plate piled high with every unclean thing that he could find there, and sat down beside me. And the way he ate that was, well, it was offensive to me. He made a show of eating the pig and eating the different things on there that were unclean. Like, look here, look, I'm a testimony to having these cleanliness rules pass away. Look how I can eat this and all of this. Well, it wasn't too much longer after that he just croaked.
Oh.
I don't know. I'm sure that wasn't the reason, but I'm thinking that certainly piling his plate high with unclean food, it was enough to have to eat that much, but all the more to eat the stuff that he thought was unclean and preached it was unclean, and maybe it contributed to his death. But yes, in the church right now, there is a pitch-in dinner once a month or something like that. I don't make a habit of going because most of the dishes, and I mean most of them, are unclean. And I also have a problem with going in places where it's evident that these unclean things are being cooked.
Yeah.
Because it gets in the air.
That's a big challenge.
It sure is.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
But I guess
because you just don't know kind of who's touched what before they've touched your food.
We can't take a Levitical priest in there with us because there aren't any. But we can.
No.
There's certain evidences. If we can smell it and it smells like a pig, then it probably is a pig. And again,
it's something that
this isn't about health to me so much, except I know it's unhealthy. It's more, what is it that I can do or not do that's going to be pleasing to Elohim?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
definitely.
A lot of people that are not pork eaters, they will like snitch unclean food, like they're getting away with. I know one lady, she would say, "Oh, he's not going to punish me for this." No, just a little bit, that kind of thing. Well, that's an attitude, a disobedient attitude.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Obviously, I believe
it really isn't a hardship to go without those things.
Not at all. Not at all.
No.
If you're going to follow the Torah, some Christians say that who can do all those 600 rules, 613 rules? Who can do all that stuff? Well, most of that stuff we can't do because there's no temple. The rest of it, it's not a chore or a bore. It is really a blessing to be able to do those things, to enjoy Shabbat, keep the feast. Nothing's more fun than that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
That's what I think about it.
Definitely. And when we consider all the laws of man, the new laws, the new statutes that are continually produced, that legalize what God has said is unlawful. Man produces tens of thousands of laws every year, and you don't hear Christians say, "Oh no, I can't possibly keep all of those." Christians are very law-abiding people, but they seem to have this. They don't want to keep this law, and yet, like you say, it's actually a great joy to keep it. Mm-hmm. It is a great joy to keep it.
I think generally there's Christians in general keep 65 to 75% of it anyway. But the reason they don't keep the rest is because their leaders. Their leaders think that the Torah was nailed up to the cross. And nowhere do we get that idea.
Yeah. No, absolutely. One last note on pork. Some years ago, I used to follow a very interesting chap who talked a lot about some of the more sort of ridiculous ideas about food and health. And one of the things that he discovered for himself was that pork is very inflammatory. Mm-hmm. And he noticed that he was actually trying to eat more protein and more fat, and he was essentially sort of eating a fairly low carb diet at that point. So he was cutting out more of the breads and pastas and eating more pork and more meat. And pork is a bit less expensive than some meats. And he very quickly discovered that this was giving him an enormous amount of physical pain. And he decided that he was going to stop having it. So he cut pork out of his diet altogether. And then at some point, someone cooked something in an old frying pan that he'd cooked pork in. And even that was enough to trigger the pain. He didn't realize until later, but then he realized that that was the saucepan. And it was a non-stick saucepan. So, of course, you know, that can, I guess stuff can actually go into the coating on that. Fascinating that he worked that out for himself, that pork was very inflammatory. But again, we don't know that that's anything to do with the reason why pork is not to be eaten. We don't know why. We just know not to do it. And
that's true. It is inflammatory, and people are beginning to discover this, that people that really care about their health or the way they feel.
Yeah.
And they're getting off of that. And I did read an article as to why that is, but I can't remember what, except there's some type of a solution in pork itself that causes that inflammation that you don't find. Well, pigs and camels have it, and a few other animals like that cause inflammation, and beef and sheep, they don't have it. So there is a chemical reason for
but
that.
Interestingly, there's a chemical reason why that's the case and it's bad for you, but that may have nothing to do with why it's unclean. Because again, when we look at grains and we look at, for example, red kidney beans, which if they're not cooked properly can give you a really, really nasty, it's almost like food poisoning. There's so many plant foods that have to be prepared so carefully. So again, it's just a fascinating subject. And I hope that tonight I have increased the audience's sense of awe in our beloved God, that he has given us rules which we don't need to understand the why. We just need to do the thing and just obey him lovingly, because he has our best interests at heart throughout all of this.
Definitely. I'm sure that we'll have lots of opinions when this goes up.
Yes, and I would love to know what people think, if they've got any better ideas about the why. But again, the most important thing is that we obey. Our need to understand is just a human part of us. It isn't necessary for our walk. And in fact, sometimes our sort of what we think is going on, it sort of gets in the way of us walking in obedience. It's very important that we do that because we love God.
Very interesting.
So I hope that was interesting. Some interesting questions there.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Maybe I think maybe you came up with some answers. I think you had some answers.
Yeah, there's definitely some. Yeah, there's some very curious things there. There are certain things that I can sort of understand a little bit better, but that doesn't mean that I truly understand what that is. You know, what is uncleanness? What is cleanness? It's a fascinating subject.
Well, let's call for some opinions. If you're listening to this, or you're reading this, or you're seeing it on this video, then let us know what you think. There are a lot of experts out there on every subject that you can possibly imagine. Just put it in the comments. We'll look at that and we'll answer you. And maybe you can just answer the questions that we have. Amen.
Yeah. Yes.
Great.
Fantastic.
How are you enjoying Ukraine now?
Oh, well, it's still beautiful. We've got snow at the moment. Lovely.
And how's COVID
really, really nice.
There?
Very pretty.
You have a bad COVID outbreak in Odessa?
Well, we've had. Yeah, well, apparently, yes. But again, you know, people here generally are not going to, they don't really want the vaccine here. They're not keen on this at all. So it's not easy to get people to take it. But yeah, I'm still loving it here. Very, very happy.
Great.
It's a beautiful
I love
part of
it
the world.
that you're loving it there. If you run into
Yeah.
Brother Schruumkoff over there, let me know. Okay. Hey,
Will do.
Les, thank you very much. This has got me thinking. This is going to be on my mind all day.
Thank you.
Okay, sis.
Great. Wonderful. Thank
So-
you so much for having me. That was just great.
Love it.